All right, welcome to the Pilgrim Song, episode 15. I'm Alexander. This is your other host, Charlie. And yeah, we're excited for this episode. Excited, nervous for this episode.
Yeah, very nervous.
We're going to be talking about some stuff that is. This episode is going to go along with next week and the week after that. So we're doing our first kind of like serious thing. But we thought this was an important topic to address. And we're hoping that will be very encouraging, but also, step on some toes because we need to be encouraged forward. And I think there's things that have been said that need to be said. So, the
first toes that we're gonna step on are, I know for sure, mine at least. We'll see when we get into it.
So, hope you guys will keep listening, and of course it continues to go on that if you have something that you disagree with what we've said, please let us know. Especially we have an Instagram page now, so you can come and hit us up on there if you have questions. So, yeah. But getting into it, so have you watched much Rhett and Link when you were growing up?
I did actually, yeah. I was a pretty big Rhett and Link fan, and it probably started in late elementary school, I guess, when they were just like, if you're not familiar, they're YouTubers. They started off with like song parody kind of stuff where wouldn't parody, they would write like funny songs about different things in life, like cornhole and their favorite pillow and that kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I don't know why they were good singers. It was fun music. And so it was fun as a kid. And several of my friends were too. And then they started a podcast and they started a morning show as well. And, I did watch that for a long time. So yeah, I was a pretty big Rhett and Link follower.
Okay, yeah. So I wasn't. Their humor wasn't really my thing, personally. But like I know, like a lot of Christians watch them because it was humorous, but it was also clean.
Yeah, very clean.
So people are looking for that, and that they fit that niche really well. But as you were talking about their podcast, it's called Ear Biscuits, which I think is a funny name. It's pretty clever. But they last year, right before COVID really hit, they did a podcast on why they deconstructed their faith, why they are no longer consider themselves Christians, and it's an interesting podcast. And I had some when I was listening to the podcast. Especially like Rhett's was the one that was more intriguing to me because he came to like an intellectual side of it where it wasn't really based on his emotions. It was like I did some research here and here and here, and I just decided that I wasn't part of that faith anymore. So that was the one that was more compelling to me. Did you
I agree with that. A lot of Rhett's arguments are like, I know for me personally, ones that I have actually heard a lot of, probably the most of. Like you said, it was a little bit more like, as we'll see when we get into this a little bit more, he used like a lot more statistics. He did a lot more research, kind of like you said, and came up with a lot of things that I think the majority of people would probably like also know about and also kind of feel the same way, more so than Link's. I mean, Link's was good, but like, I would agree with you that Rhett's was probably a bit more of a compelling argument against Christianity.
For sure. But he didn't touch on the resurrection very much, and that's my biggest qualm. Like, if you're gonna disprove Christianity, you have to start with Jesus and then move from that point. You don't start everywhere else and then move away from it. But regardless, listening to the podcast, I listened to a ton of responses to it. I don't know if you did, but I listened to a lot of responses to it. And I felt pretty confident coming out of it. Like, I was like, okay, I can see some of the things where he changes perspective. I don't think that it was good enough reason to not be a Christian. I'm very attached to that position, but it was interesting to listen to. But then they had a year later, and they posted this pretty recently. I don't know.
Yeah, it was the beginning of this year.
Beginning of this year. So they were talking basically about what they've come to the conclusion after 1 year after being outside of the what they call over and over again the evangelical church. So we wanted to just kind of address some of the things that he talks about in Rhett's particular his 1 year later, because I think there's some good stuff for us to at least mull over in our minds, some things to reflect on and meditate on. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Ready to go?
Let's dive in.
Alrighty. So opening up in the first 5 minutes, we have this. He makes this comment that most of the people who talked to him or commented, they were encouraging. And even the people who disagreed and were still Christians were still like, we respect, how you've ended up in this position. We hope that you come back, that type of thing. So I think that's really encouraging, because I get very nervous when Christians typically comment on things, because it comes out with so much vitriol rather than grace and mercy and love. And I think that's just something that needs to be balanced. Like, social media does not mean that you have separated from an actual person. You are still talking to an actual person. And I believe James 3 still applies in those types of scenarios. And we have to be very mindful and very aware of how the effects that can have. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I agree. It's great that was the initial reaction to that. As we'll see here in a little bit, that didn't necessarily last. But it's still good that first overwhelming rush, in the most vulnerable period, probably right after they, put themselves out there and opened up about all this, the initial reaction was supportive. Even if, maybe we disagree with it, right? We still respect them as a person. We still love them as a person. And so, yeah, I would agree. That's really good. And that's a good reaction to start off with.
Yeah. So I think that when someone deconverts or something, the attitude can't be a push them further away.
Right.
It's still, I'm going to love them as God loved them, that I'm going to still leave the door open, that whenever you need to come back, whenever you see that Jesus really did die for your sins and you need him, the door is always going to be open. So I think that's a really important aspect of how we live our lives as Christians. And I think that handling it in that way is beneficial. Hopefully Rhett and Link will come back in the future. So, but then, there are other people who claim some different things. So do you want to start this one off?
Sure. So it seemed like pretty much right after this first wave of encouragement, there was a second wave of not so encouraging things that happened. And the whole idea behind it is that Christians and people who are a part of the church, their first reaction was, oh, they left? Oh, they were never Christians to begin with. They were never strong to begin with. Which I think is something that, I know I've heard people say stuff like that before about different situations, specifically when people leave. I don't know if you've ever experienced that sort of situation.
Sometimes.
But yeah, we see this turn from love and support and encouragement to now it's denying that they ever had faith to begin with.
Yeah. So that's a pretty big part of the struggle. And I don't think either of us really identify as evangelicals or Protestants. But, I kind of understand a little bit of the Calvinist interpretations of once saved, always saved, or perseverance of the saints, however people are willing to take that. But from our perspective, you can be faithful and then decide that the faith isn't what you want to be a part of anymore. And I believe that that's what Hebrews, a big part of it is warning people about. Don't return to the things of old. You need to stay faithful. And I have one passage I want to read out of Hebrews chapter 10. It says, starting in verse 26, "For if we go on sinning deliberately after receiving the knowledge of the truth, there no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a fearful expectation of judgment and a fury of fire that will consume the adversaries. Anyone who has set aside the law of Moses dies without mercy on the evidence of 2 or 3 witnesses. How much worse punishment do you think will be deserved by the one who has trampled underfoot the Son of God, and has profaned the blood of the covenant by which he was sanctified, and has outraged the Spirit of grace? For we know him who said, 'Vengeance is mine, I will repay,' and again, 'The Lord will judge his people.' It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." So it's a very frightening passage, but it comes in this book of Hebrews that is about God has not let you go, that God is full of grace. And the way that you go out of his grace, especially if you've been in it, is to trample Jesus underground by neglecting the sacrifice that he's given for you and turning away from him. So it's a really heavy passage over in Hebrews 10, but it's a reminder that you can be faithful and you can fall away. So we have to that's part of the importance of being diligent and making sure that we are remaining faithful. So it's a nerve-wracking passage, but I don't think that, as long as I genuinely think, like, as long as they're baptized and they confess Jesus, I think they're good. But once you turn away from that, you start having some problems.
I think this is, like I said, this is something that I've definitely heard before, people saying, I think it happens actually quite a bit when we see people who, are Christians that fall away. Will say things like, oh, they were just claiming to be Christians, different little jabs like that we like to take at them. And, I don't know this, but I feel like this comes from a place of coping with this, right? We try, it comes from a place of denial, where we try to make ourselves feel better about the situation. When someone leaves, we try to come up with some sort of reason, some sort of explanation as to why someone would have left the church without ever actually hearing their story. Because I think it's easier for us to wrap our minds around someone who didn't have faith falls away. Okay, that makes sense, versus someone that was strong, someone that did have a lot of faith falls away. If you yourself have never struggled with that or never asked those kinds of questions, it's kind of difficult for you to understand how someone else could go through something like that and ask those questions and eventually lead themselves away from the gospel, from the Lord. This kind of goes along with last week's podcast. So if you haven't listened to episode 14, in that podcast, we talk about the idea of judgment, whether or not, we should, or when we should, and how we should make judgments against different things. We don't know someone else's heart. Only the Lord does. And Peter, I think, is a good example. When you're reading through Hebrews, I think we can look at an example of specifically someone who I think most of us would probably agree with was pretty strong in the faith, right? We see that in Matthew 16 when he makes that declaration of faith to Jesus, and Jesus calls him out for that. And talks about how, on this rock, on that faith, that whole basis is how the Lord's church was going to be built. But just a few chapters before that, we see him try to walk on the water with Jesus, and he sinks. And then even a few chapters after that, at the end of Jesus' life, we see him completely deny Jesus and never being a part of him. And so, again, we have that example of just because you fall away, or maybe you question God at times, and maybe you get led down a path that leads away from the Lord, does not in any way mean that you were never actually close to the Lord to begin with. I think it's unfair for us to make that assumption and to make that judgment against people, because we don't know. And that's, I think, what Rhett is talking about when he's talking in this section, is that, he very much was a strong Christian. And if you actually took the time to look at his life and to look at what he and Link did, right, I don't know that they would have ever come across to me if I had been close friends. I'm not close friends with Rhett and Link, but if I had been, I don't know that I would have ever assumed that they were even struggling at all, because they were very strong. They were very active. They did a lot of really good things. They wrote a lot of songs, like a lot of Christian songs, church songs, things like that. Yeah, they were extremely active in the community. And so they would never have come across in such a way of even questioning faith. So, like he was saying, I think it's unfair for us to assume that. And I think that upset him, as it rightfully should, as it would probably upset any of us if we were in that situation. Yeah.
So it's a harder a weighty thing to enter into the podcast with, where he's talking about just people making a lot of assumptions and a lot of judgments, rather than judging with proper judgment, rather than seeing the fruits of the labors at this point and praying for their repentance and coming back to him later in their life, Lord willing. So it's a good way to start, though. I think that they address that in a very interesting way. But our next section, we're going to be talking a little bit more about some of the things that Rhett was thinking as he decided that he was going to leave the faith, and things that he didn't think they were things he wanted to believe. So we're going to talk about that a little bit when we come back. So as we get into our second section, we want to talk a little bit about evangelical and what that even means. Evangelical basically is a wider group of Christendom that includes pretty much everybody who really the whole point of it is that they hold to the gospel that Jesus came, is God, died, was resurrected, and ascended, and he's coming back. So broad sense, there's a lot of people who fit in the category of evangelical, but the big reason why I guess Charlie and I don't subscribe to that is just, we don't really want any title other than just Christian. That's what we want to be. And then Protestants are naturally the break off between Catholics and those who were against Catholicism back in the Reformation age in the 1600s. So those are kind of the things that he talks about. They don't really aim at us in particular, but I do think that some of this is applicable, which is why we want to talk about it.
Yeah.
So.
Yeah, everything that he says is he used very generalized statements to when I think when he, as we get into this more, all of his statistics and stuff that he uses are all against like specifically like the evangelical church, and he'll say that over and over again. But it's kind of a broad thing that he's applying that to pretty much mean I feel like all Christians, even though I don't know if that's fair. But I mean, still that's so when we talk about the evangelical church, that's what he says, and we're applying that then to ourselves. Yes, because I think, like you said, we can draw out of that for sure. Yeah.
So, but one of the reasons that he claims that he left, one of the reasons he says is that he did not like the doctrine of hell. And he said, when I really thought about it, it's not even something I want to believe. And the reality is, if you ask me, like, I don't want to believe in that either. Like, I don't like the idea of torment or whatever hell is going to be. We see in Revelation, it talks about a lake of fire and all this type of stuff. But it also talks about Jerusalem literally being gold. So, is hell just a pit of fire? I don't think heaven's going to be a golden city. So like, I don't know. And hell is one of the hardest aspects, one of the hardest doctrines that I believe is required for us to teach. But what I have come to conclusion is when I think about hell, I have to first think about my trust and faith that I have in God. And throughout history, God has not failed. And he is someone who I can trust through all situations and trust that he will be faithful. So then at the end of time, I can trust that he is going to be a faithful judge over those who did what he asked versus those who didn't do what he asked. And then when we think about heaven, like the conclusion of Revelation talks about, it gives me goosebumps every time I think about it. But it's this picture of God, his place where he belongs is dwelling with man, and man's place is dwelling with God. So if you don't want to dwell with God, if you don't want to listen to what he says, why would you want to be in heaven? Like if you don't want to listen to his principles. Now, naturally, that means that, he's the ultimate basis of love. So if you don't love the way he does, that means that you're not going to be in heaven and that type of thing. It's not an easy teaching, but for me, it's made so much more sense because at the end, I know that all the wrongs will be made right. And justice will be had, and I can entrust that to a God who is good. So that's where I get my confidence and why I can talk about hell a little bit more freely. But yeah, you have anything on that?
No, I mean, that's, you stated it, I think, really, really well, because we don't know a lot about hell, and we don't like it's tough to talk about sometimes because it is such a scary idea for any of us, because that the idea that you could end up somewhere forever being tormented it's awful. And I think a lot of people, I know of like several people that are scared of Christianity and scared of the gospel because of that reason. It's the question of how could a God that is, quote, loving send someone to eternal punishment? That's not fair. That's not just. That's not right. Actions that you participate in for 80, 90, whatever, however many years you have on this earth could put you in a place of forever punishment. But I like what you kind of said about that. And it's the idea of looking at it from more of the perspective from heaven, less of the perspective of hell. And it's just this idea of, the number one thing we know about hell is it's somewhere that God isn't. And never will be because he can't be. And heaven is where God is, and that's where we can be straight up directly with God. It's like being back in the Garden of Eden, even. But yeah, and if you've never read the book The Great Divorce, like
Yes.
10 out of 10 would recommend.
Absolutely.
By C.S. Lewis, and I think he does a great job of illustrating the idea of heaven and hell, and it's fascinating because it's someone. C.S. Lewis was never we don't really know that he was much of a reader of the Bible. He's really more of a someone who kind of reasoned his way to God and thinking like about philosophical deep ideas, and so his illustration that he has of heaven and hell in that book is really, really cool. And I would recommend that if you want to maybe think about it in those ways. I won't go into too much detail, but I think it's a great read.
Exactly. So I think that Christianity, at least the beginning, when you become a Christian, if you're doing it and you're afraid of hell, I think that's kind of reasonable. But as you grow, you realize that Christianity is not about running away from hell, just totally afraid. It's running towards God, because I can't imagine a life or an afterlife without him.
Right.
And that's what Christianity becomes. So that's what if I were to speak to Rhett directly, that's what I would encourage him to think about that. And I think as Christians, that's something we'd be meditating on, because I think sometimes we want to like really freak people out with hell, when rather it's supposed to be a pursuit of God. Jesus didn't say run away from hell. He said follow me. So,
and sometimes we ourselves get freaked out about. I mean, like if I think about it for too long, I get freaked out. If I'm just sitting at home thinking about hell, I'm like, oh my goodness, like, woo! Like let me go pray right now because I need to get forgiven, because boy, I don't want to go there. And if you're someone that's listening to this and maybe you're struggling with this idea, you're not alone in that. If you're someone who's really, genuinely scared about hell, feel free to reach out. I mean, we'd love to talk to you. And,
absolutely.
Have a conversation with you, because I know it's something that I think a lot of people struggle with.
Absolutely. So really, really, it's a tough subject. Again, don't want to trivialize it, but we want to be honest about what we believe about it. And I do think it's ultimately God's justice being done. It is. So, so after he talks about this a little bit, he basically breaks off and starts talking about the way that Christians handled 2020, and basically why he was so thankful he wasn't an evangelical or a Christian when he headed into this year. And this is what the rest of the podcast that we're going to be talking about is. Right. Basically these big three things that he was like, this is what I did not like about what the church did in 2020, and that's why I'm thankful that I left. So
this is really the meat of his entire argument against the evangelical church. I think this is something that he is not alone in feeling this way. 2020 was there's no words to describe what 2020 was. It's something that I don't think any of us will ever forget, and we'll tell our kids about, and will be passed on throughout history. And we're still struggling with a lot of the stuff from that even now. And I know personally it forced me to think differently about a lot of things in my life, and ideas that I had and things that I had been told my whole life and believed my whole life, and began to question because of things that happened last year, and just different things that we were forced to not necessarily go through, or things to think about. Because there was a lot, and we're going to talk about probably the three biggest things that occurred between this podcast and the next. And so
I think you're right. 2020 was a year for meditation on why was this such a tremendous failure? I think on the church's part in some ways. Like what about it did we do so incorrectly? How did we approach it in a way that was wrong? So
this is going to be difficult. This is difficult for I know me to talk about. I'm sure it is for you some too, and it's difficult for us to hear. So if you disagree with anything, like we said at the beginning, please feel free to reach out. I'm still developing my ideas and thoughts on a lot of these things now, and probably will be for the rest of my life, because I don't think we'll ever figure any of this out. So, and we're about to step all over my toes. So,
so the first topic that he addresses is how the church handled racial injustice. So if you go and decide you want to watch his video, this happens around 31 minutes. And he talks about, he uses some research that comes from Robert Jones, who he is like a director, I believe, of the Public Religion Research Institute. So they have a website and all this stuff. So we had to look up the statistics because he was kind of going a little bit fast through it. So we had to go through and look these up for ourselves. But as he goes through, he talks about that white Christians are nearly twice as likely as the religiously unaffiliated whites to say that the killings of black men by police are isolated incidents. So he comes right out by using this as an example of saying that, why are white Christians so against the idea that that there could be systemic injustice when it comes to policing and stuff like that. And I'm not like, I don't know what else to say to that, but like that's one of the big things that he comes out. He also talks about Confederate monuments, and using the exact statistics, he says that white Christian groups are most likely to view Confederate monuments as symbols of Southern pride rather than racism, including strong majorities of white evangelical Protestants, white Catholics, and white mainline Protestants. So non-white, like just these other situations, like, so other people see the Confederate statues as symbols of hatred, racism, all that type of stuff, slavery, while other people, mostly white Christians, white Protestants, don't see it as any big deal. It's just Southern pride. So that there's some problems, I think, with that thinking. When it comes to police shootings and stuff like that, I think that there needs to be a reform on both ends. I think that there's been too many times where police will shoot somebody and then they're like, oh, the footage got corrupted or something like that. And it's like, okay, we should be able to see what the police are doing. They're supposed to be public servants. But there's also a responsibility, I think, from black communities to stop being so resistant. Like there's a lot of that happens. So when we are we need to call on just both people to get their act together. Essentially, that's what I think. And we're going to talk a little bit about the racism index and why I think it's a little bit problematic a little bit later. But I think particularly the Confederate statues one is one that I feel a lot more strongly about, right? Because I majored in history. So if anybody who doesn't want just history destroyed, it's me. Like, I don't want to just, I want to totally forget about the Confederacy or that's not true. But if people are harmed because of these statues or because they see Confederate flags flying around, I don't agree with that. And ultimately, I'm not going to try to make a political statement with this point, but rather as a Christian, why would you be endorsing any behavior, whether that be flying Confederate flag or trying to defend these statues, that is literally harming other people? Why would you do something that is not showing this type of love to them? And it's not like it's harming your life. You just get rid of it. Right. So anything that's going to impact your ability to spread the gospel to people, you need to get it out of the way if it's something as trivial as this. So that's my big struggle with this thing. So I will say to your face, I've said it from the pulpit, like, don't fly Confederate flag. Don't be in defense of these statues. You can teach history. You can love and appreciate history. Do not stand on the basis of these monuments and stuff. So,
and what we may not realize, because we don't necessarily see it because it's not advertised as much, as it may not harm people always physically, but it harms a lot of people mentally. And again, that doesn't really get publicized much because we don't know people's minds, but like that, I know a lot of people really struggle with the idea of those statues being up and the flags being flown and things like that. And we'll talk about this later, but it kind of goes back to the idea of being a stumbling block against other people. And just the question you have to ask yourself is, if you're someone that does support that and fly those things, is what is your attitude behind that, right? Is your Southern pride that you have getting in the way of you showing love towards somebody else? Because I think it can be. And is that person someone that's a Christian? And if the answer is no, am I pushing them away? Am I being a hindrance to them by flying these things in my yard or my house, or supporting them being up in my cities? Am I keeping that person from potentially, being a brother or sister of mine? A question that most of us don't want to ask, because we know the answer to that question is going to probably be, I should not actually be doing this because it's not a super nice thing. And so, yeah.
And I think that it's not just, they see these Confederate statues and they just hate these people. I think that there has been this classical association, which I don't think is totally fair, but with Christianity and slavery. Yeah. and Rhett talks about this a little bit in the podcast, and we'll handle it a little bit later. But when people associate Confederacy with Christian and Christian with slavery, that's an obstacle to the faith. And we need to do whatever we can to separate ourselves from those ideas that we want to ultimately glorify God. It doesn't matter about these statues. Yeah. So,
and this one hits hard because we're, in case you may not know, we're filming this podcast. We both live in Tuscaloosa, Alabama. So we're very much in the heart of the South. So, I mean, this hits, if you may be listening from this from somewhere up north, and that's, but we are living here in the midst of all this going on. So it definitely hits home for me. Yeah. I know it does.
Yeah. So one of the statistics he also quotes is that white evangelical Christians are over 2/3 more likely to disagree with the following statement, that generations of slavery and discrimination have created conditions that make it difficult for Black Americans to work their way out of the lower class. And this is a toughie one. So.
It's a tough one. So let me say it in a different way. Because that's kind of a bit of a confusing statement. Yeah. How many times have you heard someone say the line, or maybe you yourself have said this? I'm just going to be honest. I've heard it said. I've said it myself before in the past as well. Like, the reason someone is poor, specifically a Black person, is because they're just lazy, or they would just rather live off the government or welfare, unemployment, something like that. Then they'd rather do that than go out and get themselves a job. So it's more based off of their laziness, less of maybe some larger issue that's kind of going on in the background. Mm-hmm. And I think this kind of brings up the idea of privilege, which I know is a fun word to say in 2020 and 2021, because it's a very controversial and divisive word, even though it's just a word. When we deny that our success in life can be somewhat attributed to some sort of luck. I know as Christians we don't like to use the word luck because we believe more in the Lord and in His working. But what I mean by that is our success can be in some way attributed to an outside source. I think when we deny that, there can be some issues. So, for example, I heard this statistic. It is public. It is very much true. I've fact-checked it many, many times. But I'm a big NHL fan. I love NHL hockey. There was a study that was actually done into NHL players. From the years 1980 to the year 2007, 36% of the players drafted into the NHL were born in the first quarter of the year. This means that they were born from the months January to March, compared to only 14.5% that were born in the fourth quarter. This means that if you are a hockey player and you're born on January 1st, you are more than twice as likely to be drafted into the NHL than you would have been had you been born literally a single day earlier. And that's kind of insane. It means you have absolutely no control over the day that you were born, right? None of us, I don't think any of us as the person in we don't have control over when we're going to be born. Do you know what the cutoff day is for age class hockey? And I know specifically Canada, which is the number one country for NHL players.
I have zero idea.
It's January 1st. So that means that if you were born on December 31st, you are playing in a league with people who are basically a year older than you, people that could have been born on January 1st of basically the year before you. That means that you're at a pretty large disadvantage, that person, because you're going to be smaller, you're going to be less developed, because you are basically a full year behind those people, which means the faster kids that are a full year older than you are going to be the ones more likely to get into travel leagues, are going to be scouted once they get older, to lead to scholarships, which eventually will lead themselves to going into the NHL. But the interesting thing about this is when people interviewed NHL players about the reason for their success, you never once heard this coming out of one of their mouths. The typical answer was what we would most all think of, which is, well, I worked really hard for this. I practiced every day. I put in the time, and I was rewarded. I did all these things and I was rewarded because of my hard work. So if you work hard, you can do this too. And had absolutely no recognition of the fact that, maybe it was just because you were born January 1st instead of being born December 31st, something that you had absolutely no control over. And so, I use that as an example to kind of get some understanding for us. The question is why? Why do we like to leave out, some sort of luck or some sort of chance that may be involved in our success? Why don't we want to admit that there was maybe some outside reason for why we have been as successful as we are? And it's a tough question. But after thinking a lot about it, I think it's because when we admit that, it makes us feel like we didn't have to work hard for our success. We are denying ourselves of the pride that would go along with feeling, that would go along with what we feel like we've achieved in our lives. You're giving that up. And that's difficult because I don't think any of us want to admit that, we're only successful because of, what we were born into or the way that we were raised or because of the color that we are. Especially if you're someone who maybe grew up with absolutely nothing and was able to be successful, like a lot of the NHL players were. But the question still remains, why are white evangelical Christians the majority of this group that deny the idea of privilege and deny the idea that maybe the reason why so many black people struggle is because of the fact that there is a bigger issue, a bigger racism issue at hand? Why is it specifically the church that would deny this? Because if you think about us as Christians, the whole idea of our faith is based off of the grace of God. Hopefully we recognize that what the Lord did for us, right? We in no way have earned any part of our salvation whatsoever. You might disagree with that, and I would disagree with you on that. And I would love to have a conversation if you do, but that's the whole idea of grace, is the fact that we can't earn. We did nothing to earn our salvation. It is only because the Lord loves us enough to give us a chance to be able to be with him someday. And he was even willing to go as far as to have his son die for us and give himself for us so that we may be able to have that. Nothing that we did. It's all because of what the Lord has done and how lucky we are. And so why don't we take that same mentality and apply that into our physical life, not just our spiritual life, but into our physical life?
Yeah.
So I honestly, I genuinely don't know. And maybe I'm ignorant. But I'll ask you, why do you think white evangelical Christians represent the majority of this group?
Yeah. I think that at least a little bit is a pushback against the idea of privilege, because I think that there are some people who have mischaracterized privilege. True. I think that there are some people it would be insane for you to say that Barack Obama is a less privileged person than some white guy who's living in a trailer park. Obama is far more privileged. But I think some people have made this idea that because of this, whoever's in this trailer park, he is more privileged than Obama. And that's what white privilege is. And it's that's not what it is. It's that there are some things that there are advantages to when you're white. And there's some things that you have advantages when you're being black. And there's advantages when you're rich. There's plenty of things first world, just being a first world citizen, that comes with a lot of privilege as well. So I think it's just kind of a rebellion against particularly more liberal culture where people see that being portrayed in the media, and then Christians more aligned with the right side. So we're going to push it back against whatever the liberal media or liberal people are trying to say, and this is going to be our defense, rather than saying that, sure, I may have reached this place because of work that I've done and hard work that I've done, but there's also been a lot of life circumstances that I've been in that have gotten me to this position, and that there can be a complete balance between those things. Yeah. So I think we have to really divorce our political leaning from our Christian faith in order for us to understand both sides of any issue.
It's a pride thing.
Yeah.
I mean, like, yeah. Who wants to say that? Oh, I'm only successful because I've been handed things.
Yeah, that would be ridiculous.
Nobody wants it. Nobody wants. I mean, maybe some people want to admit that, but I don't think most people would be comfortable admitting that.
Yeah, and I think that's why the grace of God can be really difficult too. It's like, well, I did what was required. God asked me to do this, so I did this.
I was baptized. I've lived right. Like, It's
like, well, the reality is none of that saves you if God wouldn't have extended His grace. Right. So, it's a difficult concept.
Yeah, and I don't know. I think it's also easy for us as white people. We really, really, at least I know, I hate the idea that slavery happened. Mm-hmm. And so we, including me, want to bury racism slavery specifically, as if it never happened. Because it's uncomfortable, right? I hate the idea that there were people that ever did that and actively participated in it and enjoyed that and liked it and wanted it to stay and still want it to stay. And so my then idea is to, well, let me just completely push this away and pretend like it's not an issue anymore and say, like, we're no longer racist, right? We've gotten past that. We've moved past it. We're better than those people. But in reality, man, we are not that far removed from. We like to think that that's ancient history, that was such a long time ago in America, and we've moved so much further away from that. And there has been progress that has been made.
Absolutely.
But in the reality of the situation, that's just a couple generations ago. Mm-hmm. That's not that long ago. If you go back a single generation to like when our parents were kids, when our grandparents were our age and raising family, that's when, you had extremely active, like, things like the Klan and that kind of stuff that was going on, mm-hmm. which is arguably just as bad as slavery in and of itself. That's not that long ago. That's just a few years back, and we're not that far. I don't know why we try to feel like it was ancient history and bury it as best as we can and try to deny that it's still an issue today. Maybe it's because it's just awkward. We don't want to feel like we're bad people. I don't know.
Well, I mean, we were looking up on Sunday, and literally interracial marriage was not legalized in the state of Alabama until 2000.
Oh, I did not realize that. Wow.
So 20 years ago,
yeah.
I would have had some troubles. Like, and that's genuine. Yeah. Like, it's not ancient history. We do have to grapple with it. And I think, and there's absolutely a way to grapple with it in a non-political way and in a Christian way. So we do not want to be conflating our political leanings with ultimately the Christian faith. But we have to be very aware that this is a struggle for our nation. And what we should do is be aware of the struggles that are going on and how we spread the gospel in a place where this message is there. So I think that's a pretty big aspect of this. Yep. But in our next section, we're going to be talking about Robert P. Jones, who introduced a lot of these statistics, and he put out in his book this racism test. And we're going to talk a little bit about why it's pretty messed up. So we'll be right back with that. So a little bit earlier in our podcast, we talked about a guy named Robert P. Jones who came up with this racism index. He's a researcher, and he's written a couple of books, The End of White Christian America, and his most recent one, which is White Too Long, and it's talking about white supremacy in the Christian church. But in this book, he put this racism index, and that was some of the quotes, the statistics that we used earlier and that Rhett used in his video that come from his website, which we're going to post a link to in a little bit. So, he used some of these statistics, but there's a little bit of a problem with this racial index that Robert P. Jones uses in this. So, for instance, he says, do you think most white Americans have benefited from racism against minorities? If you answer the question, they have not, that was scored as a racist answer. But then the problem is, in a CNN-sponsored survey, which none of us would consider them right-wing or anything like that, but among Black and Hispanic people, 27 to 39% answered have not. So are you literally saying that these black people who do not think that that white people have been more benefited, that they are racist? But that's what the racial index would tell you. Let's see, another example. It's really a matter of some people not trying hard enough. If blacks would only try harder, they would be just as well off as whites, which sounds really, really rough. And when you say yes to that answer, that means that it's scored as racist. But in the CNN survey, yet again, 42% of the black respondents agreed with that statement, would get to the affirmative. So again, are they being racist against themselves? And that's kind of the flaw of this test, is it's not only a dichotomy of answers, but also if you even maybe have this perception, this opinion, then you are considered racist. Not that it doesn't ask, do you look down on black people? It's, what about these other social types of things? So again, I think there needs to be a balance between how we understand privilege and how that works, but also an idea that we need to find a balanced position of this thing can be wrong, like police brutality can be wrong, but it's also wrong for people to resist the officer and kill them, which has been a problem in the last 2 years of the rise in cop killings and stuff like that. So both of those things are bad, and we should speaking out against both of those. So it's an interesting thing that we have kind of arrived at in this. When you have a racism test like this, it's impossible really to judge how people are racist. So you have to take those statistics with a little bit of a grain of salt, but just be aware of like your thinking towards racial issues in this country and how you've handled them the past year. So that's a lot of Rhett's thinking and a lot of his argumentation. Is there anything else that you want to bring up about what Rhett had to say, at least for this part?
Yeah, in this section, I think that pretty much covers the majority of what he was trying to say against the white evangelical church, as he would refer to it as, and as most of his statistics point to. Mm-hmm. And again, like you said, if you want to look at any of these statistics, if you want to look at the tests and all these different things, we'll have the links for all those posted. You're welcome to check those out. You're welcome to read through them. And form your own opinion about them, because there's even some statistics on there that we didn't talk about, and they're really, really interesting. Yeah. And it breaks it down more than we even did too.
For sure.
We mentioned on one of them, but it has like evangelical, Protestant, Catholic, non-white Christians, like all these different categories.
And like the years.
And it shows you the years. And it's really fascinating to watch how, like, for a lot of groups in 2020 it would go down, but some groups it actually went up. It's really interesting to kind of see, and it's eye-opening. And even though it's about the white evangelical church, as we call it, I definitely think this is an issue in the church with us today. Mm-hmm. As Christians, I think all of us face these issues and have heard these things before and have dealt with these issues before. And so that's why I think this is such an applicable thing for us today, especially today with all the issues that are going on around us, for sure. Mm-hmm. So,
yeah. Part of what Rhett also talks about in this section is slavery. And he's like, I was told that Christians were the ones they were the abolitionists, they ended the slave trade. And then the more I researched, the Christians were the ones who actually perpetrated the slave trade. And I think he's on both sides. Like there are people who I think misinterpreted and misread scripture to wind up at the place of slavery.
It's fascinating if you read the accounts from like the church in the north and the church in the south. Yeah. Both of them would preach, like more northern churches. There was a history book reading through that talked a lot about this. More of the churches in the north would preach against slavery and would use scripture to justify not abolishing slavery, but then a lot of the Christian churches in the South would use scripture to justify slavery. Mm-hmm. And so, like, yes, the Christians probably did both of those things because they were playing both sides of the ball game in that situation. Yeah. It's kind of sad.
Yeah,
so
it is. But when we look at the Christian ethic, when we look at truly what God desires, He does not desire these people humans enslaving one another, but rather we be servants of him.
He wants us to love each other.
And love each other, like just the baseline. So
just show love to everybody.
So that's my bigger struggle with Rhett, and I think we'll probably talk about this again at some point. But like the idea that Christians did bad stuff in slavery, it's like, okay, everybody did. I don't understand how this becomes it's the Christian's fault type of thing. So that's one of the places that I kind of disagreed with him. There's a lot of places I did, but regardless, as we get into the 39th minute of the video, he says that so many racist ideas in his church, wherever he went, that they were not being challenged and were actually being perpetrated in church in ways that we were blind to. And this statement is pretty much where he ends that. And it was so frustrating for me to hear that, because I want to know genuinely, in your church, what did you hear that had perpetrated a racist idea to you? Because as little as I've heard about race talked about from the pulpit, I haven't heard an idea being perpetrated from the pulpit. Have you had something like that?
Yes.
Okay. Well, there you go.
I have. Well, things that I would think would be yes.
Gotcha.
So,
all right. Well,
yeah.
So Charlie has a different opinion than me on that.
I got you.
But
I think that fully depends. So you're from Atlanta.
Yeah.
Right. And the congregation that you grew up with is, I would say, very diverse. Probably much more. I visited. It is much more diverse than anything that I grew up with, for sure, which is an all-white church. And when we moved, we went to an all-white church. And then we moved again. It was an all-white church. So, interesting things can happen in those cultures. So,
for sure.
Like he talks about in one of the stats that he uses, and I meant to put this in here, was Sunday mornings are the most segregated time in America. And I don't think he's wrong in that.
No.
So, yeah, I don't know. I had a little bit of a different experience growing up, and even still now, I still have heard people use scriptures in ways that I would think would be wrong and against what God is actually intending, and use it in a very unloving way against people based off of their race, specifically with black people. But that is a conversation for another time. So
that's unfortunate to hear. I guess my experience is a little bit different. While I didn't hear it growing up, I never assumed that anyone was really racist around me. It wasn't until I really left for college, and I got really what you were teaching your kids came out when they came to college. Right. And that's when it really started clicking with me a little bit more.
And it's not just from the pulpit.
Yeah.
I mean, most of that stuff, like you said, it's in the home, and it's what people pass on to their children, whether they intend to or not. The things that they would say, the things that they would, gestures they would make, just different things whenever you were around other people. And it taught you to behave in the same way and think those things without necessarily realizing it.
Gotcha.
So
yeah. So that's unfortunate, but I think that's something that, I know it's something that needs improvement, because if we're going to fulfill the royal law, we're going to fulfill love your neighbors yourself. This is something we need to be actively speaking out against. And that's why we're talking about in this podcast, not so we can make a political statement. And that's not the goal of this podcast. The point that we really want to be emphasizing is that handling racism is a gospel issue. You cannot claim that you love God if you do not love your neighbor. So that's what I really hit on. And then last year, 2020, as Charlie was talking about, it's a really difficult year for a lot of reasons. And we're going to talk about some of those in the upcoming episode. But part of them was the riots last year and the protests last year. And those were really, they were some hurtful times. I had a lot of anxiety. I was a little bit frustrated at a lot of things. I had to make sure that if you get on Facebook for too long, you start, as is a coined phrase now, I didn't know it was in the dictionary now, but you start doom scrolling, and you just get angrier and angrier at the things that are going on. You see people who are either like, I'm from Atlanta, I saw the city getting destroyed, I was so angry at that. But I also saw people who are like, racism just does not exist anymore in America. And I'm just like, that is so wrong. Both of those things are not right.
Or racism exists, but it's the other way around, where it's the black people oppressing the white people because they're the ones destroying.
It's just
goodness.
So there was a lot of rough things that happened in 2020. I think it made way for some really great conversations. Absolutely. And I had a lot of good talks with people, and I'm looking forward to continuing that talk.
And it seems like this conversation, a lot of times in the past when things like this have happened, the conversation relatively quickly dies. Mm-hmm. But I feel like now it's really starting to stick a lot more. And I feel like more people are open to having the conversation and thinking a little bit more deeply on this and realizing just how deep this issue goes, whether or not you've been exposed to it growing up or whether or not you think you've been exposed to it growing up. You start to actually think about your life and the things that you've thought, things that you've said, things that you've done. Mm-hmm. I think that's happening. Maybe it's not, but I think that it's happening more. It seems like it's happening more than it ever really has.
Yeah. So I'm very thankful.
Yeah, it's great. It's fantastic.
So especially like at Northwood, I've had a lot of really thoughtful, kind conversations with people. So it's been really good. But I just want, as we conclude this, I just want us to think a little bit about what happened this past summer with the protests, because I saw a lot of people who were condemning violence, and I agree. I do not believe that violent protest is the way to go. Martin Luther King and I still have some work to do. I'm still trying to work with some of the things in his past, but I'm very much like a Booker T. Washington guy. I really appreciate him and some of his writings, so that's more the guy I listen to. But it seemed like a lot of last summer was deflection of these protests are hurting people or they're burning down businesses and all this stuff. And it's like, I agree that that's wrong and that you shouldn't commit violence against people. You shouldn't be beating up white people because some cop shot somebody in a state three states away from you. Like, both of those things are wrong. And I hated the justification of, well, it's just a business. And it's like, that's just really inappropriate to me for use. Some of that is like Target, okay, maybe a little bit different. It's a corporation. But some of it is just people's livelihood, and you're destroying your own community. Like, there's some things that are wrong with that. So the protests absolutely hurt people. And I stood against it then. And I also stood against the riot on the Capitol on January 6th. And one of my big problems was I saw people standing up to the things this summer, but then said absolutely boo about what happened on January 6th. And that was frustrating to me. That bothered me quite a bit. Also, Black Lives Matter as an organization is something I don't agree with. When you tell me that Black Lives Matter is trying to get rid of the family unit, I've read the website. I agree. That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to get rid of the nuclear family. I stand against that. But my problem with it is it was never, I disagree with the organization, therefore, but I'm going to continue to affirm that I love you and care about you. It was always, Black Lives Matter is wrong. And on very few occasions, I had someone say, I'm really, I hate the stuff that's going on. I don't really like that Black Lives Matter is doing this type of thing. But Alexander, your life matters to me. And Jesus cares about both of us. And just really reaffirming that. It just seemed like everything had to be, look at all this awfulness going on over here and not going and reaching out to other brothers and sisters who perhaps were going through a lot of pain this summer. And I know for me personally, like for other people, maybe that it was not a big deal. But for me, like I had a lot of anxiety and I stayed inside a lot more this summer than I typically would. And I had a lot of personal frustrations with what was going on. And not having that affirmation from people who I care about and love was hurtful in a lot of different ways. So I think that when we come out with this perception of, just getting down on Black Lives Matter, I think it does two damaging things. One, it doesn't always it's okay to disagree with the organization, but you should do your best to reaffirm that you care about people in these type of situations. But I also think that when we come down on Black Lives Matter as an organization and we don't see that there is other problems within this, like if an innocent person gets shot by the police, we should be like, well, that's an innocent life lost. We should do something about this system. Or maybe it's not even the system. Maybe it's this cop in particular who needs to be thrown out. And when it's just always defending the cop or always defending the black person, it's always going to be a divide. So I think we just need to be less obsessed with the media and less obsessed with how we see all the rest of the stuff, and rather seeing people as individuals and souls in need of the grace of God. And until we break it down to that level, we're going to continue to have these problems. We're going to continue to have riots, and other people are going to get really hurt. So that was pretty much when talking about protests, that's pretty much my take. In 1 Corinthians 12, Paul talks about weeping with those who weep. And that applies to so many different situations. And I think it applies to this situation, that if someone is really feeling the social burdens of what's going on, you should be weeping with them. You should be trying to help them in any way you can, and being there and trying to be understanding. And Romans 12 also talks about, we can hold fast to what is good, what is true. And that is, we should hate racism, and we should abstain from what is evil, which, is Black Lives Matter as an organization, is something that I think does far more damage than it's supposed to, than good it does. So there's a balanced, nuanced way how to view all these issues. And I think that if you cast out everything, then you're going to miss, at least part of the point. And that is that lives that God has created in his image still matter. So really want to emphasize that aspect coming out of this. So Rhett's conclusion of it is that Christians have been on the wrong side of the fight against racial injustice. So do you agree or disagree with that? How do you feel about that, Charlie?
Man, I don't think it's just a Christian thing. I think it's across the board. I think because not all Christians are racists, and that's my biggest beef with, I guess, a lot of his arguments. Mm-hmm. When he would use a lot of the statistics against the white evangelical church, he was saying that, because 70% believed this, therefore they all did, and therefore I don't like the church because therefore the church is that way.
Yeah.
But the stats are the stats. And if it's true that it is the majority of Christians, then I would probably say, yeah, but not all Christians are that way.
Yeah. And I agree with you. That's my biggest beef with this, is he made this, he's like, okay, I'll take a statistic that even if it's like 40%, then I'm going to generalize the entire population as this.
Yeah.
And that was my biggest thing. And I think that every place that I've been, at least, I have been welcomed and loved and cared about. And that's not the way that I would be loved in the world, where I would be either loved exclusively for my skin color, where that's all that people see, or hated because of my skin color, because that's what people perceive. There's just kind of this variety of things. But when I come into worship with people, I know that we are all there because Jesus' blood was poured out for all of us. And that's what makes us, we shouldn't be, I guess, making a very political argument about racism. That's not our goal. It should be about, in our churches, in our lives, are we living out the gospel? And that means that's a gospel that does not discriminate along the lines of race or ethnicity or anything like that. So the conclusion of his argument is where I disagree, that the church has been just always, or the white church, whatever, has been on the wrong side of justice in this country. I just think that's unfair. But there are things that we can certainly grow on, and that's why we talked about it today. So
we're certainly not perfect, and nobody is, and we absolutely have room to grow, and can take this time to grow and to be better, because ultimately we're supposed to be like God, and there are certainly things that are being said that God would definitely not say and would not agree with, and that Jesus would not say. Just show people love.
Yeah.
Love your neighbor, like you said.
Yeah.
That's what we're called to do. That's what we're supposed to do. And you may not realize some of the things that you say, some of the things that you do, things that you think go against that. But I would urge you and challenge you to really, really take a minute, when you're hearing this, think about your life. Think about the things that you have believed and said. Think about specific situations in your life when you have been with someone or had an event where you were in some way with someone of a different color, a different race than you. And think about your thought process, what you thought of that person, how you viewed that person, things that you would say to that person. And ask yourself the question, do I truly love them like I'm supposed to? And maybe the answer is yes, and that's fantastic, and continue to do that and be a good example. But I think you might find that, maybe you're not as good as you think. I certainly found that out the hard way last year in a lot of ways. So use this opportunity to grow.
And that's what, at the end of the day, the Christian faith is about. Like, that's one of the bigger things is like when people make mistakes, it is not, and when we talk about racism on this podcast, it's not so that we can just be like, we're trying to dissociate with you and we hate you and all this type of stuff. It's rather, we come to repentance. We come to growth. What we're constantly called to do is to be growing and maturing. And if this is a place that you've struggled, it's a place where you can mature. And that's why we talk about it. And that's what everyone needs to do. So when we hear something from the pulpit, when we read something from scripture, it's about, how do I apply this? How is this going to call me to greater spiritual maturity in Christ? And that's why we talk about it. So anything else that you had to say on this?
That's all I have.
Yeah. A little bit of a heavier one today. It is,
yeah. So. And there's more. We'll talk about this in future podcasts, I'm sure. So get ready.
It'll be fun. But their episode is pretty long, as this episode probably is pretty long as well. But next week on the podcast, we're going to be handling the rest of the video where they talk about 2 other really big things they think happened in 2020 that had a negative effect on how they view the church and how other people view the church. So we have to be a little bit alert, just thinking about how the way that they saw this and perhaps the effects it will have on us in the future. So again, we're not trying to spread divisiveness or try to push any political opinion here. We're just really focused on what our important call is. And when Jesus was asked, what is the most important thing? He says, love God. And the second thing is like it, and it's love your neighbor. So those 2 things are so critical. They're the most important pieces of doctrine that you will ever know. And that's what we're just trying to talk about here. So again, if you do disagree with us, please visit our Instagram, or I think there's an email now. So you can use that if you still use email. So if you disagree, or you have some more thoughts and you want to let us know, please let us know and send us over a message or whatever. But thank you guys for listening to another. Well, this has been a heavier one. Last week was all right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we hope that you guys have a blessed week. We hope that you'll love more, you'll work hard, and you'll trust God.